The Young and the Restless Spoilers. Claire's happiness when Kyle slipped the ring onto her finger was undeniable. A pure surge of joy that momentarily erased the doubts and insecurities that had been gnawing at her for weeks. Yet as the euphoria of the proposal faded into the quieter hours of the night, a shadow returned to her heart, heavier and darker than before. Because while she wanted desperately to embrace this new chapter of her life with open arms, she could not silence the truth that was growing inside her body. A truth that left her both terrified and paralyzed. She was pregnant. At first, she told herself that the timing could be explained away, that love had a way of rewriting calendars and memories. But the more she counted backward, the more she felt the walls closing in. 2 months along, the doctors confirmed, and with every heartbeat she heard during that exam, her soul trembled, because Kyle had not been with her in that time frame, not in the way that would create life, and no matter how she twisted it, she could not bend the reality into something that would fit the story she wanted to believe. Kyle, oblivious in those early days, showered her with plans for the wedding, speaking about flowers, vows, and the life they would build together. But she felt his eyes linger on her body with a subtle shift, as though instinct had already whispered to him something was changing. He was overjoyed at first when she told him she was expecting, his face lighting up as though fate itself had smiled on them, but his joy soured quickly when instinct collided with logic, and he realized that their intimacy had not aligned with the timeline she presented. Confusion bled into suspicion, suspicion hardened into anger, and soon his voice, usually warm when it wrapped around her name, grew sharp with accusation. Claire tried to hold her ground, insisting through trembling lips that the child was his, weaving explanations about miscalculations and rare medical anomalies. But Kyle knew her too well, had studied the cadence of her truth and the cracks of her lies, and he could see the panic behind her eyes even as she reached for him with desperation. Each denial she gave only made the silence between them louder, and the house that had once been a sanctuary of dreams now felt like a stage where betrayal was the only script. Kyle's questions became relentless, each one hitting her like a blow. Who was the father? How could she do this? How could she stand there and pretend? Claire's tears poured freely, not just from guilt, but from fear. Fear of losing the only man who had ever made her feel seen beyond her shadows. Fear of becoming the villain in her own love story. Fear of a future where she stood alone with a child she could not name honestly. She thought of the night that had led to this lapse in judgment, the fleeting comfort in someone else's arms, the way she had convinced herself afterward that it was meaningless, an error she could bury beneath the stronger truth of her love for Kyle. But her body had betrayed her, and the life within her was now the evidence she could neither erase nor disguise. Kyle's rage erupted one evening in a thunderous shout, echoing against the walls as he demanded, his voice breaking with both fury and heartbreak, to know who the father was. But Claire could only cry harder, clutching her stomach as though protecting the child would protect the lie, swearing over and over that the baby was his even as the timeline mocked her words. Yet when he pushed for a DNA test, her resolve faltered, terror flashing across her face, because she knew that submitting to science would unravel the fragile facade she clung to. And so she resisted, making excuses, pleading for trust, hoping against hope that his love would outweigh his logic. But Kyle was not a fool, and the more she begged, the more he realized she was only stalling. His heart ached with betrayal, yet beneath the fury lingered the cruelest cut of all. He still loved her, still wanted to believe her, still wanted the family they had envisioned. That contradiction tore at him, driving him into nights of restless pacing, torn between the loyalty of his heart and the evidence in front of his eyes. For Claire, the days stretched into a nightmare where she oscillated between frantic denial and quiet despair, whispering to herself that she could fix this, that if she just held on long enough Kyle would forgive her, that love could conquer even this. But deep inside, she knew she was unraveling, that each lie pushed them further apart, that every day without the truth was a step toward a chasm she could never cross. The pregnancy, once something she might have embraced with joy, became a cage of secrets and shame, binding her to a choice she could no longer control. She told herself to be strong, to stop being foolish, to accept reality with dignity, but the words felt hollow when spoken against the relentless weight of her fear. The question of paternity hung over them like a storm cloud, refusing to dissipate, casting shadows on their love, their future, and their very identities. Who was the father? Could Kyle ever forgive her if the answer was not him? And would she ever find the courage to face the truth? Or would she drown in the lies she had built around herself, dragging both her and Kyle into a darkness from which there was no escape? Under the golden lights of Genoa City, Claire thought her life was finally settling into the steady rhythm she had longed for. Kyle's proposal had been everything she dreamed of: romantic, earnest, filled with promises of a future where she would never have to doubt her place in his heart. She had felt radiant that evening, her laughter echoing as she accepted his ring, a symbol of devotion and family that she believed would bind her to him forever. Yet beneath that sparkle of joy, another truth had already begun its slow, cruel climb to the surface, a truth she could not suppress with diamonds or whispered vows. Her pregnancy had turned from a private fear into an undeniable reality. At first she convinced herself it was a blessing, a miracle that would seal her bond with Kyle and prove her worth to his skeptical family. But as the weeks passed, the calendar became her enemy. 2 months! That number repeated in her mind like a curse, and with every passing day, the distance between her secret and Kyle's devotion grew unbearable. He noticed the subtle changes in her body, the glow that should have filled him with joy. But instead, suspicion flickered in his eyes. When she told him she was expecting, his initial reaction was exactly what she had once hoped for. His face lit up with excitement, his arms around her, his words overflowing with plans for a nursery, for the child they would raise together. For a fleeting moment, she almost believed she could carry the lie forever. But Kyle was not blind. He loved her too deeply to ignore the cracks in her story. Their intimacy had been scarce during the time conception must have occurred, and when he pressed her with questions, her answers faltered. He began to count the weeks, his sharp mind piecing together the timeline with devastating clarity. The more she insisted, the more hollow her words sounded. The confrontation reached its boiling point at the clinic, where the soft hum of the ultrasound machine filled the room with an intimacy that should have been sacred. Claire, with trembling hands, watched the screen as the tiny flicker of life appeared. Kyle, standing beside her, felt his chest tighten with conflicting emotions. It should have been the happiest moment of his life, but all he could hear were the lies echoing beneath the steady thump of the baby's heartbeat. When the nurse gently mentioned the possibility of a DNA test to reassure both parents, Claire's body stiffened. She shook her head quickly, spinning excuses. Tests were invasive, the baby was too fragile, they should wait until after birth, trust was more important than science. Her words came out in a rush, tangled in desperation. Kyle's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he fought to keep calm. But her refusal was the final nail in the coffin of his hope. Without another word, he pushed back from the chair, the scrape of metal against tile slicing through the silence. He left the room with heavy, deliberate steps, his chest heaving, his love for her colliding with the unmistakable realization that she had deceived him. Outside the clinic, Kyle paced furiously, his heart torn between heartbreak and rage. He had given Claire all of himself, his love, his trust, his future, and in return, she had given him a child whose very existence now mocked him with uncertainty. He wanted to scream, to confront her again, to force the truth out of her trembling lips, but he also knew if he stayed, he would shatter into pieces too small to gather. So he left, abandoning the sterile walls and the ultrasound image that should have been the start of his happiest chapter. Back in the silence of her home, Claire sat with her hands over her stomach, tears spilling unchecked. She whispered apologies to the life inside her, to Kyle, to herself, but the words brought no comfort. She thought of the night that had led to this weakness, the vulnerability, the solace she had sought in Holden's arms when Kyle had been distant and distracted. It had been a moment she convinced herself was meaningless, a mistake to bury deep and forget. But life had a way of exposing secrets, and now every kick, every flutter reminded her of that one irreversible lapse. She wanted to believe love could rewrite reality, that Kyle's devotion could blind him to the truth. But his sharp questions haunted her. Who is the father? How could you betray me? It was in that haze of grief and fear that Holden appeared, standing at her doorway as if summoned by fate itself. Claire froze when she saw him leaning casually against the railing, but there was nothing casual in the intensity of his gaze. He stepped forward, his presence filling the space with unspoken accusation. Claire's breath caught as she unlocked the door, trying to block his entry, but he followed her inside without hesitation. The house suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in as he crossed the threshold. His voice was calm, steady, but beneath it simmered an edge that sent a shiver down her spine. He asked questions she had dreaded from the start, questions about the baby, about Kyle, about the timing that no lie could erase. Claire tried to deny, her voice breaking as she repeated the same hollow line, "The baby is Kyle's." But Holden's eyes betrayed no belief. He moved closer, his tone low, reminding her of the night they had shared, the choices she had tried to dismiss, the intimacy that could not be undone. His words pierced through her armor, and the air between them grew heavy with the truth she had tried so desperately to outrun. She crumbled into tears, her hands trembling as she clutched her stomach, torn between shame and fear. Holden did not shout, did not accuse her with anger like Kyle had. His quiet certainty was far worse. His silence told her he already knew, that he understood his connection to the life she carried, and that the fate she had constructed was crumbling before her very eyes. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was her sobbing, broken and raw. Holden watched her, his face unreadable, but his presence pressed down on her like a weight. She realized then that no matter how fiercely she clung to her lies, the truth had already taken root in both men's hearts. Kyle's fury had erupted into shouts and ultimatums, but Holden's calm acknowledgement was like a blade slipping silently between her ribs. She could not escape it. The question of paternity loomed larger than ever, threatening to destroy not only her relationship with Kyle, but also the fragile image of herself she had fought to preserve. She told herself to be strong, to face reality with dignity, but fear silenced her every time she tried to speak. The DNA test was inevitable. She knew, yet she still resisted, terrified of the finality it would bring. Until then, all she had was denial, but denial had become a prison, locking her away from both love and truth. Kyle's absence weighed heavily on her, his hurt radiating in every unanswered call, every night he did not return home. Holden's presence, meanwhile, became a haunting reminder of what she had done, of the night that had rewritten her fate. In those quiet hours, when she sat alone, Claire realized she was living in a tragedy of her own making. The ring on her finger felt heavier than any chain, the promise of a future, with Kyle now poisoned by secrets she could not undo. She wondered if love could ever survive such betrayal, if Kyle would ever look at her again without seeing the shadow of another man. And she wondered if Holden, standing silently at her door, with eyes full of truths she feared to hear, would force her hand before she had the courage to face it herself. In Genoa City, secrets never stayed buried. Claire knew her time was running out. The truth of her child's father would not remain in the shadows forever, and when it finally emerged, it would shatter not only her heart, but the fragile bonds of loyalty and love that held together the lives of everyone around her.